casting memo was 2 sentences long. Replace Hollis with Crane, younger actress, aging makeup, faster on marks. 14 words to erase a woman who'd once had her name above the title on 57 motion pictures. 14 words that Gary Cooper read on a Tuesday morning and spent the next 3 weeks quietly making irrelevant. April 1955, Republic Pictures, a mid-budget Western called The Broken Land. The production was unremarkable in most ways. Solid script, competent director, the kind of picture that would fill theaters for a few weeks, and then fade into the back catalog of a studio that made 30 films a year. Gary Cooper had signed on because the schedule worked and the character interested him. An aging gunfighter returning to the town he'd abandoned 20 years earlier. The role that would change everything was barely a role at all. An elderly frontier woman, the gunfighter's former neighbor, now widowed, running the general store alone. 3 scenes, 4 minutes of screen time. The kind of part that got filled from a list of reliable character actresses who could show up, hit their marks, and not slow down production. The woman originally cast was Margaret Hollis, 71 years old, 5'2", a face that the camera had loved 40 years ago when faces were everything and voices were someone else's problem. She'd made her first picture in 1912, her last in 1931. Somewhere in between, she'd been one of the most recognized actresses in America, the Prairie Rose, they'd called her, famous for westerns where her silent presence conveyed more than dialogue ever could. Then sound arrived, and Margaret Hollis discovered that the voice she'd lived with for 43 years didn't match the face that had made her famous. It happened to dozens of silent stars. Some adapted, learned to modulate, took voice lessons, found new personas that matched their new sounds. Others didn't. Margaret's voice was thin, reedy, with a Midwestern flatness that clashed with the romantic mystique her image had projected. Directors who'd praised her expressiveness suddenly couldn't find roles that fit. Studios that had built campaigns around her face quietly stopped calling. By 1932, Margaret Hollis was unemployable. By 1935, she was forgotten. By 1946, she'd sold the house in Hancock Park and moved to a small apartment in Glendale, living on savings that dwindled a little more each year. 9 years without a single day of work. 9 years of watching the industry she'd helped build pretend she'd never existed. And then somehow her name had surfaced for The Broken Land. A casting director with a long memory, a role that seemed to fit, a chance, small, fragile, probably her last, to stand in front of a camera one more time. She'd rehearsed for 2 weeks before production began, learned her lines until they lived in her bones, arrived on set 20 minutes early every morning, dressed and ready, determined to prove that whatever the world had decided about her voice, she could still do the work. The studio had different ideas. Here's what the memo actually said, because the full version reveals more than the summary. Hollis Margaret, role of Ellen Crawford footage review, indicates pacing issues in early blocking rehearsals. Hollis requires additional time for mark adjustments in line delivery. Recommend replacement with Jennifer Crane, see attached. Younger actress, aging makeup, proven efficiency on compressed schedules. Hollis performance adequate but production timeline cannot accommodate. Please advise by Wednesday EOD. Adequate, the word sat in the middle of that memo like a verdict. Not bad, not wrong, just adequate. Not worth the extra time she needed. Not worth the patience her older body required. Not worth the investment of a production that measured everything in dollars and minutes. Gary Cooper read that memo because his assistant had flagged it. Thought you'd want to know, she'd written in the margin. Hollis was a big name once. Cooper pulled the production files, found Margaret's original screen test from 3 weeks earlier. watched it alone in his trailer, the black and white footage flickering on a portable screen. What he saw made him pick up the phone. She was remarkable, not despite her age, because of it. The scene was simple. Ellen Crawford learning that the man she'd loved 20 years ago had returned to town. The script called for shock, then guarded hope, then the careful reconstruction of a face that couldn't afford to show too much. Jennifer Crane, whoever she was, would have performed those beats competently, hit the marks, delivered the lines, given the director exactly what he asked for. Margaret Hollis did something else entirely. She let silence fill the spaces between words, let her face carry decades of accumulated loss, let the performance breathe in a way that modern actresses, trained on tighter schedules and faster cuts, rarely attempted. It was slow. The studio was right about that. It required patience, required a camera that was willing to wait, required an audience that understood that sometimes the most important moments happen in the pauses rather than the words. It was also the best acting Cooper had seen in months. He called the director, a workmanlike professional named Frank Borzage, who'd been making pictures since the silent era himself. "Frank, I saw the memo about Margaret Hollis." "Yeah, the studio wants to replace her. Pacing concerns." "What do you think?" Borzage was quiet for a moment. "I think she's extraordinary. I also think the studio's going to do what the studio wants to do, and fighting them directly is a losing game." "What if we don't fight them directly?" "I'm listening." Cooper explained what he had in mind. It took 10 minutes. When he finished, Borzage laughed. Not with amusement exactly, but with the recognition of a professional seeing a solution he hadn't considered. "That's either brilliant or insane," Borzage said. "Can you make it work on your end?" "If you can make it work on yours." "Yeah, I can make it work." "Then let's not tell the studio until it's too late to matter." The first private rehearsal happened that evening, after the official production day had wrapped. Cooper found Margaret in her small dressing room, still in costume, staring at the mirror with an expression he recognized from his own worst days, the face of someone waiting to be told they weren't needed anymore. "Miss Hollis, I'm Gary Cooper. I wondered if you might have time to run some scenes with me." She turned, and Cooper saw the silent film star underneath the 71 years, the bone structure that had launched 1,000 close-ups, the eyes that had carried whole narratives without a single title card. "Mr. Cooper, I'm not sure She stopped. "I heard there were concerns about my pacing. I've been trying to work faster, but I'm not here to talk about pacing. I'm here because the scenes between us are the heart of this picture, and I want to make sure we find something true together." She studied him, looking for the catch. There was always a catch in this business. Stars didn't rehearse privately with day players unless they wanted something. "What did you have in mind?" "I want to see how you'd play the scene in the store. The first one where I come in and you recognize me. Forget the marks. Forget the timing. Just show me what you'd do if the camera wasn't there." Margaret Hollis had spent 40 years learning the language of the camera, every gesture calculated for the lens, every expression pitched for maximum clarity in a two-dimensional frame. The idea of performing without that consideration was foreign, almost frightening, but something in Cooper's face told her this wasn't a test. It was an invitation. "All right," she said, "let me show you." What happened over the next hour would reshape the entire production. Cooper asked Margaret to lead the scene, to set the tempo, to let her instincts dictate when she moved and when she paused. He followed her choices, adjusting his own performance to complement rather than compete with her rhythms. By the end, they'd found something neither of them had expected, a dynamic that made both performances stronger. Cooper's laconic style, which sometimes read as simply slow, gained depth when played against Margaret's deliberate silences, Her pauses, which the studio had flagged as pacing problems, became moments of unbearable tension when Cooper held still inside them rather than rushing to fill them. They rehearsed again the next evening and the next. By the end of the week, their scenes had become so intricately choreographed, so dependent on specific timing, specific looks, specific beats that only worked because of their particular chemistry, that replacing Margaret would mean replacing Cooper too, and nobody was going to replace Gary Cooper. The studio liaison, a man named Arthur Brennan, who was responsible for keeping productions on schedule and under budget, noticed the changes in the blocking during the first day of actual shooting. "What happened to the original staging?" he asked Borzage. "Cooper had ideas. We workshopped the scenes." "The scenes with Hollis?" "That's right." Brennan watched the monitor during the first take. Cooper entered the general store. Margaret, behind the counter, looked up. Their eyes met. And for 15 seconds of silence that would have made the studio apoplectic if they'd been planned, neither of them moved, neither spoke. The entire weight of 2 decades of separation hung in the air between them. "Cut!" Borzage checked the gate. "That's the one. Moving on." "Wait." Brennan was still staring at the monitor. "That was one take?" "Cooper and Hollis rehearsed extensively. They know exactly what they're doing." "But the pacing is perfect. Watch the playback." They watched it again. The 15 seconds of silence that should have felt slow felt instead like a held breath, the kind of moment that audiences lean forward for, waiting to see what happens next. "The studio wanted her replaced," Brennan said slowly, "and now she's essential to every scene Cooper's in. Replace her, you have to reshoot everything. 3 weeks of footage. Cooper's entire performance." Brennan understood what had happened. He wasn't stupid, but he was also practical. "The footage is good?" "The footage is exceptional." "Then I suppose we're keeping her." Margaret Hollis never knew about the memo, never knew about the phone calls or the private rehearsals designed to make her irreplaceable. She knew only that Gary Cooper had been extraordinarily generous with his time, that the director had let her work at her own pace, and that for the first time in 9 years, she felt like an actress again instead of a relic. She finished her 3 scenes, 4 minutes of screen time, a small role in a film that most people would never see, except people did see it, and they noticed. The Broken Land opened in October 1955 to modest box office, but unusual critical attention. Reviewers who expected a routine Western found something else, a melancholy meditation on time and loss, and the things we leave behind when we walk away from the people we love. And nearly every review mentioned Margaret Hollis. "The quiet heartbreak of the entire picture," one critic wrote, "rests in the weathered face of Margaret Hollis, whose wordless moments opposite Cooper convey more than 100 pages of dialogue." "A revelation," wrote another. One had forgotten what real screen presence looked like until Hollis appeared, carrying 40 years of cinema history in her silence. "If there's any justice in this industry," a third review concluded, "Margaret Hollis will work again after this. Her Ellen Crawford is the soul of The Broken Land, a performance of such devastating restraint that it makes everyone else look like they're trying too hard." There was justice. For once, briefly, there was justice. Margaret booked another role within 2 months of the film's release, then another, then 2 more the following year. Her second career, the trade papers called it, a late-life resurgence that nobody had seen coming, a silent star who'd found her voice in a new generation of pictures. The roles weren't large. Supporting parts, character work, the kind of jobs that kept a performer active without demanding the 18-hour days of leading roles. But she worked. Steadily, respectably. From 1955 to 1959, Margaret Hollis appeared in 7 films, each one building on the reputation that the broken land had unexpectedly restored. She gave interviews during this period, gracious, humble, still faintly surprised that anyone remembered her name. "I was lucky," she told one reporter in 1957. "The broken land came along when I'd given up hope. The director believed in me. Mr. Cooper was extraordinarily kind, and somehow it all came together." Lucky, she used that word a lot, the vocabulary of someone who'd been beaten down by circumstance and couldn't quite believe that circumstance had relented. She never learned the truth about those 3 weeks of private rehearsals, never discovered the memo that would have erased her, never understood that Gary Cooper had spent every evening for 3 weeks reshaping his own performance specifically to protect hers. He'd never told her, never mentioned it to interviewers, never claimed credit in any of the ways that actors claim credit for generous acts. The whole operation had been designed to be invisible, to look like luck, like timing, like the natural chemistry of two performers who simply worked well together. And it had worked. Margaret Hollis died believing she'd simply been remembered at the right moment by the right people. She never knew she'd been protected. She never had to carry the weight of gratitude for something she couldn't repay. Some people would call that a loss, the tragedy of someone never knowing who saved them. But there's another way to look at it. The gift Cooper gave Margaret wasn't just the role. It was the story she got to tell about her own comeback. A story about luck and talent and being in the right place at the right time. A story that let her own skill take the credit rather than someone else's intervention. That's a different kind of generosity, the kind that gives people their dignity along with their opportunity. Margaret Hollis died in 1962, 3 years after her final film role. The obituaries called her a silent film legend and a late career revelation. They listed her accomplishments from both eras, the 57 silent pictures, the 7 sound films that capped her career. They quoted critics who'd praised her work in The Broken Land. None of them mentioned Gary Cooper. None of them knew there was anything to mention. The footage remains. That's the thing about film. It preserves what happened even when the story behind it fades away. Somewhere in an archive, on a reel of nitrate that's slowly degrading, there's a scene in a general store where an aging gunfighter walks through a door and an elderly woman looks up from behind a counter. They don't speak for 15 seconds. They don't have to. Their faces carry everything, the recognition, the regret, the 20 years of absence that can't be undone. It's the kind of moment that modern films rarely attempt, because modern films don't trust silence the way silence deserves to be trusted. Margaret Hollis is extraordinary in that footage. Not adequate, not passable, extraordinary. Every choice she makes is precise and true and alive, with decades of accumulated craft. And if you know what to look for, if you understand what Gary Cooper did in the 3 weeks before those cameras rolled, you can see something else in the frame too. You can see an actor who's deliberately holding back, making space, letting his co-star's performance breathe. You can see the calculation underneath the chemistry, the professional generosity of a star who's using his power to protect someone vulnerable. You can see what it looks like when someone decides that another person's career matters more than their own convenience. The studio memo is probably lost. Filing systems from 1955 rarely survive intact into the present day. The evidence of what almost happened, the 14 words that would have erased Margaret Hollis from the picture entirely, exists only in the memories of people who are themselves fading away. But the footage survives. And in the footage, there's a woman who was supposed to be replaced, standing in front of a camera, doing the work she'd trained her whole life to do. 4 minutes of screen time, 3 scenes, a small role in a film that changed an ending. Some protections are visible, contracts, policies, rules that keep people safe. Others are invisible. the quiet arrangements made by people with power on behalf of people without it, the adjustments that never get documented, the favors that never get claimed, the moments when someone decides to use their position to shield rather than to strike. Margaret Hollis got her second career because Gary Cooper spent 3 weeks making her irreplaceable. She never knew. She died without knowing. But she also died believing in her own talent, believing that she'd earned her comeback through skill and luck and timing, believing that the industry had finally remembered what she could do. That belief was a gift too. Maybe the most important one. If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. This is a dramatized story inspired by real people and events. Specific dialogue, scenes, and side characters are creative reconstruction for storytelling purposes.